Hello, Shamai, and welcome to Spare a Thought. I'm your host, Tom Spare. In each episode of this podcast, I interview interesting people and organisations who are doing important work in areas of society that are often misrepresented or underreported in the media. This episode is being released just after International Women's Day, following on from a conversation that we had with Professor Laura McAllister and Laurie Roberts, where we discussed Welsh women's football and the advance of women's sport. I wanted to talk about the progress of women at a more fundamental level. In February last year, I recorded this conversation with Dr Iain McKenzie for a special episode of Express Radio celebrating International Women's Day 2024. I only shared part of our compelling chat, and I thought it was the perfect pairing for the previous episode. Iain was one of my lecturers at University of Kent, where I studied politics between 2010 and 2013. He was one of the first to show me that you can be both a man and be a feminist. And in fact, feminism is for everyone. As you'll hear in this episode, being a feminist isn't just about learning a few key points and calling it a day. It's a constant process of reflection, action, and growth. So let's dive into it and spare a thought for feminism. When I went to University of Kent, there was the Students' Union sort of society fair, and me and a friend of mine signed up for the Feminist Society as a bit of a joke. And we thought that was funny because we were 19-year-olds and we didn't know any better. And then I started to get more into the actual politics of it at University of Kent. And you taught me a lot about feminism, and I didn't think it was possible to be a feminist and to be a man, or to be someone who identifies as a man. I mean, I'm asking you because obviously of your background, but also I wanted to base our conversation around what men can do to help and not get in the way at the same time, because a lot of that people try to help and things don't go very well. I'd be really interested to know, when you were growing up, who were the people in your life that taught you about feminism?
In some respects, Tom, our experience is not that dissimilar. I was a late convert to the idea of feminism. For many years, as I was kind of growing up into the world of politics, becoming aware of some of the debates and so on and so forth, I was kind of leaning quite heavily into a variety of different kind of theoretical perspectives, a variety of different ideologies, kind of finding my feet in all sorts of ways. But feminism, to begin with, was not one of them. So it really came into my kind of mid-20s for me to be kind of faced with some, really strong, powerful, creative, expressive kind of arguments that got me thinking that I didn't need to be resistant to this idea of feminism, that there was actually something there for me to embrace, something for me to be part of, and something for me to kind of contribute to as I kind of came to know it. Without putting too much kind of personal kind of spin on it, it was the woman who is now my wife who convinced me that I needed to be a feminist, and I should be. And that didn't mean having to not be other things too. And that for me kind of really opened up all sorts of interesting kind of intellectual pursuits. Practically speaking, I think, it is a little bit, I often say this in class, it is a little bit like finding you've got a new pair of spectacles to kind of put on and you suddenly see the world in a whole new light. You kind of know it's the same world out there, but suddenly you see some of the issues that women face in a kind of highlighted manner that you maybe just, your other glasses just haven't quite kind of pinpointed, or they've kind of pointed to, but not really, brought it all out. And I think that sense of being able to kind of, put those feminist glasses on alongside some of the other ones too, just really helps kind of see the world in a different sort of way. Now, of course, as someone who does identify, as a man, it's not my lived experience. So, I've then got to be in a certain position of, I know this is not everybody's happy word when we talk about it, but in a position of allyship. Now, being an ally in amongst kind of feminist theorists and feminist activists, for me, can take a variety of different forms. But clearly, it's a lot about listening. it's a lot about just being very open to hearing the detail and the texture of these experiences that women and those who identify as women kind of go through. It's also, I think, about being an active part of what I think is one of the best things about feminism, which is it creates this wonderful space of debate, discussion, reflection, problematization, to throw a big kind of fancy word at it. It's kind of what it actually kind of reveals all sorts of interesting perspectives and problems that some of the other kind of big isms don't. And actually being part of a movement that kind of helps to create that space then means that there is a kind of active role, I think, in the allyship, as well as, you need the ears open to listen. But we also can be part of, actively creating a space for dialogue, because, that kind of sense of forging new problems, creating new sense of debate and discussion is something that we can all be part of, however we identify.
So, I mean, that the analogy you use about having a different pair of glasses is a great one, because it's a bit like, for example, if you're tidying up the house and you ignore the mess, and then actually when it comes to having it clean, you realise all the things that are wrong, or all the work that you've got to do. It's sort of a bit like that too, isn't it, really? Is that, and then you feel a bit tired because you're like, okay, there's a lot to process here. And then you think back to going, all the times I could have cleaned up and I didn't. It's sort of adding on to your analogy there, isn't it, really?
That works for me, Tom. And I think there are a lot of different ways in which, those of us who have that kind of commitment to kind of allyship need to do a lot of reparative work. We need to kind of figure out how to try to be valuable contributors to the social world as women experience it. And I think it's really important that men go on a journey themselves as they do that, so that there's some very profound openness to unpicking the kind of assumptions and norms and values that often go with what it means to be a man in our contemporary world. And I think the more we can be open to that discussion, and the more we can be open to, again, reflecting on all of those kind of assumptions, the better. My approach to the domestic duties is to kind of, okay, well, I'll pick a room and I'll start there.
see, open the door and see what happens, and get on with it. Yeah. Okay, cool. What I'm sort of a bit concerned about at the moment is particularly young men who are influenced by people like Andrew Tate or Russell Brand or people like that. Are you seeing any worrying trends around their views? Are they being influenced by people like Andrew Tate? Are those discussions ever coming up in class at all, or people are afraid to talk about that?
It's definitely coming up in class. We are, without doubt, seeing the very direct kind of impact of a certain conception of, or set of conceptions of masculinity. And there's no doubt that for some young men, they've been emboldened to express certain quite kind of aggressive masculinities without reserve. And I find that difficult, because I think that's one of the aspects that I was just talking about that we need to absolutely dig deep into ourselves to work on quite thoroughly as men, to be able to listen, to be able to be part of that space where we can figure out what the problem is together, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there is an issue there. From what I hear in secondary schools, it's even worse. So there's probably a wave that's already lapping on our shores in higher education that will, kind of come crashing down upon us. Now, I think there are lots and lots of reasons that we need to investigate to kind of think about what's going on. I'm very keen, and I try to do this in class, I'm very keen to talk about the kind of pornification of our society. Something has radically changed since anybody with, a small mobile computer in their hands can access pretty much any porn that they so wish. And the normalization of certain masculine, hyper-masculine kind of tropes that go with that seems to me to be a really problematic one. I would also want to situate this kind of really broadly, and this is a little bit, it's a little bit vague in some respects, but I would want to situate this in a bit of a shift in our sense of our own social and political and economic relationships, something that usually goes under the bit of a kind of vague label of neoliberalism. And what I take the kind of key linguistic marker of that neoliberal attitude to be is do whatever you want. This kind of do whatever you want attitude, of course, facilitates all sorts of things. It can facilitate all sorts of wonderful things. Let's not be shy about saying that as well. But it can really also facilitate all sorts of terrible things, because what it enables is a form of, let's not deign to call it community, but a form of kind of aggregation amongst those who do what they want to do to express these forms of hypermasculinity. And they can kind of aggregate around this, and it creates a sense of their own rightness and legitimacy that seems deeply problematic. And, like I say, there's an aggregation there. There's not really kind of strong kind of communal bonds, because there isn't really anything of value there that would hold that kind of community together. But there is a sense of, well, I'll do whatever I want. And, in this case particularly, I'll do whatever I want to women. And that kind of sense of sharing that really aggressive sense of masculinity is something which, occupies our everyday lives. It clearly is magnified by social media and all the polarization that we know that goes on through social media. And of course, as we are now all too aware, it occupies a dark web where, we now have names. We have names for these aggregates, and we call them incels and various other things. And that layering of the kind of these forms of neoliberal hypermasculinity from the dark web through to our everyday social media existence, through to our everyday lives, obviously we need to understand in detail, but it does appear to be there as something which makes a huge difference. And I think the pornification kind of runs through the heart of that.
Doing this master's, I'd never done any journalism before. I'd never sort of studied about the media world, and reading about, stuff from Stuart Hall or Habermas or people like that it makes you realize that there are structural controls that are going on around everyday stuff that we read. And we think, the BBC, that's a good website to go to, or the Guardian's a good website. But they have, it's not in the same way of the BBC's bias, because that's a separate discussion, but it's people make a choice, editors make a choice as to what news you're going to be consuming today. And it's not your choice. You think you're making a choice, but back to what you're talking about, neoliberalism, I've started to realize that I'm starting to get what Marxists and so people are saying. And it's taken me a long while to get to that. But,
I completely agree. And one of the most powerful things that kind of feminism of many varieties has taught us is that, choice is the first word, but it's not the last. Absolutely, we have to prioritize women's choices in all sorts of respects, because women, and of course lots of other minoritized groups, but in this instance, women have been denied choices. So, let's make it the first thing. Within our broadly liberal democratic system, it's important that everybody is given those choices and given them fully and richly in legal, political, social, economic, family, personal, libidinal, psychological senses, you name it. But feminists never rest with it. Well, maybe one or two libertarians, but typically feminists do not rest with that. And this is one of the things that persuaded me so much about the need to kind of embrace these different feminist perspectives and get in amongst the debates. Is that, well, okay, exactly as you're saying there, the very first thing we need to recognize is that we're choosing from a menu. And then, the menu typically has kind of, dollar signs kind of hanging around the edges of it. And, the kind of the sovereign's mace down the other side. It's kind of like money and power are just kind of hanging around the menu. So obviously, and then you kind of cut through that, with so many of the other kind of structural systems that shape our experience around, race, obviously sex, gender, sexuality, but also ability, disability, and many, many other kind of structural systems. And then you can see that we need to take choice and work with it and defend it, but also absolutely question how these choices get made and what we're doing with them. For me, that's a lesson I learned from the feminists. I take it into my life. It's like, yeah, don't deny me a choice. I want to know what I'm choosing, but then I will always question those choices, because we know that that's not the end of the matter.
In your career in academia, and obviously you've worn many different hats as well within your time at University of Kent. How have you seen the opportunities for women change? In what ways have they changed, if they have changed?
Yeah, I think it's true to say that I'm I've reached a certain age where I have a certain perspective. So, I can kind of look back a little bit and go, oh gosh, what has happened over, if I go back into my student days, what's happened over the last 30 odd years, and I think it's fair to say a lot has happened. And as we opened up the kind of the higher education system, and shifted it from the 5% to, Blair's famous kind of aspiration of 50. I don't think we ever quite got there, but, kind of certainly taking it away from that kind of top 5% who ever went to uni. Then, of course, we've seen an opening up of opportunities for lots of kind of minorities, and of course, although numerically a majority, politically one of those minorities is women. And so, we've gone from having, largely kind of, white male kind of progression through onto university, to a much more kind of open kind of group. In fact, I think actually now we're probably leaning into there being more women, certainly in kind of my neck of the woods around kind of politics and the social sciences. I'm sure that varies depending on which bit of the university you're in. So, that's great. We see that change happening, and that change gets reflected through the primary, the secondary, the kind of, tertiary, that kind of pipeline. I've also seen, of course, that what that creates then is a greater set of opportunities for students, should they so wish, to kind of pursue careers in academia. But it's still right to say that, that there is a leaky pipeline. And, within academia, those really demanding social norms around particularly childbirth and child rearing kick in a way that can create that leaky pipeline for women and make it very difficult then for them to come back into that workplace and or to really kind of thrive in the way that men might. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but there are also, I think, kind of that's a generally accepted kind of phenomenon. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And, I would love to see, should women want to, I would love to see women being able to take their kids into meetings and yes, into class. Why not? Because there's no reason really why we can't have really great conversations and have young ones around us, so why not do that? I mean, there are lots of other things we could do, but just as an example, the norm that says you can't do that to me just seems very questionable, and an example of the kind of thing that we need to, again, unpick, create that space that says, hang on, is that really kind of hard and fast? Can we not just revise that? I'd have no problem with, a newborn baby kind of hanging around in a kind of school meeting about our next kind of workload allocation. Why not? But just make it a better meeting, quite frankly. I think. Well, there we are. So these things are, yeah. So the real. So we've seen great progress, but still, I think that leaky pipeline. Just if I can reflect a little bit on the particularities of the experience of Kent, because I think possibly even since your own time, Tom, we've seen a really fascinating shift in our student body generally, but in particular, we've seen a significant increase in the number of kind of self-identifying Black women. So that's really, really interesting and wonderfully enriching for the teaching experience, because we then get, in a class on feminism, for example, we then get to talk, race, sex, gender, sexuality. And it really cuts through the debates in and amongst the kind of feminist domains brilliantly. Now, all the debates then are, again, as well, about, what, how we understand race, what kind of analytical framework do we want to use to think about that, are all then just, part and parcel of what we do around the feminist debates as well. And just bringing them together. Yes, they clash, sometimes quite noisily, but for me, always productively. And so I think that experience is one that I can reflect on and say, oh, well, that's, it's one of the reasons I keep hanging around here, because you get these enriching experiences that kind of come at you in this sort of way. And again, just help you to think differently. And if we can be in places and help create spaces where we can think differently, then I think it's still worth doing. Kind of experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, I always think back to, I think it must have been the university's, 50th anniversary sort of celebrations, and there was all these amazing black and white photos of the first cohort of students at Kent, and it's like I don't know, a couple of hundred students or something. Yeah. And obviously, it was around the time of Harold Wilson's government and his focus on universities and all that sort of thing, going to the moon. So there was a thing of sort of pioneers there, which at Cardiff, because it's not a campus, it's a hodgepodge of different buildings across the city. You don't get that sense, even though Kent has a much newer history. There's almost more of a created history there than there is at Cardiff, I think.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, the one that does it for me, I'm glad you took me back to those photos. I love the one of the 5 or 6 people kind of coming across Rutherford Bridge.
Yeah.
With, a single suitcase and someone with a guitar, their arm, and it's like, but they're all looking in their kind of slightly dapper 1960s kind of gear, looking a little bit like they're just about to go and read some beat poetry or something. And it's kind of, it looks fantastic. But what I think I like about the institution is, in terms of the kind of big picture, is that, we were really kind of forged with this hope that we could think about the world in new and interesting ways, because the old ways hadn't stopped us going to war. And one of the ways that, we at Kent, but other places too, some of the other 60s universities too, but certainly we at Kent kind of embraced going forward from 65 on, was actually, of course, to think about the role of women. And, our wonderful English department, but also then connected to some of our kind of sociologists, our literature, our philosophers and others, they drew together their expertise around the first MA in Women's Studies in the entire country. And that was at Kent. And so, that's only, relatively speaking, in terms of an institution, that's a quick trajectory from, let's open the doors and make this thing happen, to we have an MA in Women's Studies and we're the first in the country to do it. And that spirit is still hanging around. It's quite hard to find, times are tough and things, change and all the rest of it. But there is that sense in which we were kind of created to do that, part of that story. Now, we might need to be doing it in a slightly different way, with slightly different kind of sense of expectations and so on and so forth. But thinking about how we can innovate and particularly help create those kind of spaces where, we can talk about what it is to think with and, as a woman. And I think that's, Kent was right there at the forefront of that. Yeah, I think that kind of sense of experimentation and radicality kind of just hangs around a little bit in the air, even when, we're all having to kind of deal with, some fairly major sectoral issues and, how is the funding of the university system going to progress in the next 10 years and all the rest of it. So, there's some big stuff that has to be asked, and it's going to be big challenges for us all. The the kind of legacy of some of these initiatives is a legacy of creating those feminist spaces that, for me, are just some of the best intellectual, scholarly, but also kind of activist spaces to be in, because people are just trying to figure things out, and it's such a kind of typically open and reflective space. Of course, we all embrace our polemics and our various dogmatisms at all sorts of moments, but feminists are great at just teasing open the space again when they feel like it's closed. And that's why I will till the end of my days kind of hang around the feminist debates, because they just have there's a great way of thinking within that ism that doesn't quite get matched within the great kind of work that's done under socialism, liberalism, environmentalism, so on and so forth. But I think feminism does a great job of kind of creating these open spaces for dialogue. And for us men, we can kind of step in there, be part of it. Yes, listen a lot, but also be actively engaged in figuring out what's at stake.
I was talking to Laura McAllister last week. I asked her about, she's gone through that. It's sports leadership as well as various other governance side of stuff and constitutional affairs. And I said, what's the benefit of being a woman in your work, and what are the sort of pitfalls? And she said that the benefit of, even though there's not many women in the boardrooms that I'm in, I offer a different perspective, and my sort of approach is more collaborative. Do you think feminism is far more of a collaborative ism? I think you sort of explained it already, but
no, but I think there are reasons for this. I mean, I'm quite sympathetic to the general idea. I'm going to have to hesitate a little bit here, just with my own kind of, what should we say, kind of critical antennae pinging into action. But generally speaking, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that women tend to think more collaboratively, more in a more kind of caring environment, whereas men tend to think rather more competitively, and therefore, yes, with a certain kind of principle, for sure, but then principles that kind of instigate almost competition. Now, my critical antennae are kind of saying, oh yes, but is that just because, that's the way women and men are constructed under conditions of modern capitalism or some such, patriarchy, modern patriarchal capitalism?
It's a heavy thought, isn't it? And it's a bit of a, yeah.
And there'd be a lot of work to kind of, unpick that problem space for sure, because it can be unpicked in all sorts of ways. But putting my kind of critical antennae down again just a little bit, I am quite sympathetic to that notion that, us men, if to paraphrase Carol Gilligan, who gave us, of course, the phrase, the ethics of care, men are good at separation and therefore good at being individuals or individuation. Women aren't so good at separation, but they're great at communication and collaboration. Maybe less good at being individuals. Now, for her, that's a kind of complicated psychological kind of view of what it is to be male and female. But there's a certain truth. Every time I put that out in a class, most of the class will recognize it as generally true of those who think of themselves as women and those who think of themselves as men. Of course, there'll always be people who go, I'm a man, I'm very caring, or I'm a woman, and I'm very individualistic. But generally speaking, that kind of sense of care, collaboration, thinking through consequences is something I think that is very marked with respect to how women engage in the workplace. They'll work out all the consequences, look to do that. Whereas men, as I say, are very principled and axiomatic. No, this is the right thing to do. It has to be done. Do it now. While there's probably a place for that in a workplace, it's very blind to the complexity of the consequences that then will follow. Whereas women in that more collaborative mode tend to work out, well, if we do this, then, 6 consequences down the line, we'll see that this might happen. And maybe we don't want that to happen. Maybe we can figure out how to do it in a way that makes sure that doesn't. Whereas men tend to come in with, this is what the company's about and this is what we have to do and let's do it. So yeah, I think we can see that in all walks of life. Generally speaking, putting my antenna down, generally speaking, it makes sense to me. Yeah. I recognize those masculine traits in myself and try to kind of work with them, put it that way.
Yeah, and I have to say that I mean, I've been very lucky in my time working at Cardiff University that I've had access to quite senior people and having sort of conversations with men and women in places of authority in the university and being managed by. I've had a balance of men and women managing me. I prefer being managed by women because I feel like I can have a genuine conversation about failure.
Yep.
Whereas with men, it's a bit more difficult and it's more combative, and I just don't fit. I struggle around very masculine, very, sport jocks, all that sort of thing. I much prefer being in the company of people who are a bit more forgiving and compassionate.
I mean, if there was one thing, Tom, that I think kind of is exactly the badge, and you clearly see this too, but it's the badge I like to wear when I think about these things. Men need to be better at communicating, and we're just rubbish at it, generally speaking, But it doesn't mean that we can't get better. I am a work in progress, absolutely a work in progress, and I'm probably, several laps behind all the women in my life. It's kind of like, wow, yeah, just amazing levels of communication there. But just to be that work in progress, to try and be better at communicating, is one of the great things that we can as everyday people living in a world that, where we have put on those glasses and seen that it's not easy for women. Then that's one of the things that we can just do. We can just work and be better at talking. I put my hands up and say, I'm not great at it, but I know that I need to keep going at it. So yeah, sounds like you're much in the same boat, Tom.
Yeah. It's been a long process, and I think, as you say, it's an ongoing one that never stops. And again, I think that comes back to what your point of a lot of men want to find solutions, and actually, this isn't one. It's a constant learning experience, and through a different pair of glasses, that would seem like failure if it's something that never has an answer. You've given me some book recommendations of different levels of reading. If you don't mind, I'll probably share more widely, and it's a more proactive thing. Are there any particular titles that stick out for you of sort of books that you've suggested as sort of an entry level?
It's it's kind of interesting to think about what the appropriate kind of entry level text is here. I mean, there's the kind of academic in me that thinks, well, we have start with a textbook and kind of get the survey out there and give all of those things, and that's like, it's so boring, right? Okay, so there's another bit of the academic in me that kind of goes, well, hang on. When it comes down to it, you've just got to find that text that speaks to you, Now, what I think is really interesting is the Amya Srinivasan, The Right to Sex, is by no means a straightforward and easy text, but it absolutely has captured the imagination because it speaks about the particular issue, or many of the particular issues that women are facing kind of right here, right now. And I think finding the text that does that for you, whether it's the Srinivasan or something else, it could be Adichie's wonderful speech, why we should all be feminists. That's another lovely way in, just to kind of think about, big broader issues. And she speaks a lot about her Nigerian background, but also her kind of more global kind of experience and how these things connect. But I think finding the thing that makes you go, oh, good, someone's talking about incels, or oh, that helps me think about porn and why I'm not entirely happy in the way that it's developed and what's going on there, or this speaks to me as a Black woman. I've got Angela Davis's essays, and I'm just going to dive into them. They might not be, this particular version I was thinking of might not be bang on up to date, but they still speak richly to me. So you find the text that you want to get in on that I think will speak to you in that way. So sorry, that's a slightly cheeky answer to your question, Tom, because my gut now kind of says, well, spend that little bit of time in the bookshop. We are in a moment when there are still books on sex, gender, and sexuality in the bookshops. There aren't that many on philosophy anymore, but that's another story. So have a look at those books, pick them up, skim them see which ones speak to you, which ones have the stories and the issues that seem to connect with you. And that way you'll find that, I think, the entry point in. And then, if at that stage you kind of go, okay, I want to just dive into something here that's opened up in front of me as a kind of bigger, broader kind of domain, then start kind of chasing some of those references and some of those suggested text to see where it takes you. And at some point you probably will want to get to the big synthetic overview, introduction to gender and women's studies or something, and do it that way, because it'll just give you lots of other touch points to see if you want to explore further in a different sort of way. Find your connection and then follow it. Yeah, I'm gonna kind of suggest some of the YouTube videos, and there are many that you can find where Judith Butler is interviewed. Now, Butler was infamously kind of difficult in terms of her writing, a little bit unjustified, to be honest, because actually once you get into it, you get the rhythm of it and it makes complete sense, and it's magical kind of stuff in all sorts of ways. But as a conversationalist, utterly engaging and revealing, and able to kind of express fascinating ideas with just a well-turned phrase.
And that concludes this episode of Spare a Thought. My thanks to Dr. Iain McKenzie for inspiring me to be a feminist and for agreeing to sit down and discuss feminism and the role men can play in progressing equality and equity for women. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afrocuster, Magugu and Asha Jane. The show was researched, written and edited by me, Tom Spare. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.